house here, and for him to do anything, it's super spread out. And we were visiting my auntie in Surrey. She lives almost in White Rock, so we got a car. Not on the station, of course. You can't travel with a rental car on the station. That's not right. No. So, and Scott laid it down. He's like, we're on vacation. I don't want to stay on the res. I'm like, okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Good call.
Fair enough. We'll pay extra on top of the res and just get a hotel now. I found a really cool little
Glenn.
cider. It's lovely. It's not too far from here.
Kind of a good group. I feel like everybody here doesn't like each other because they're really well spaced out. So.
Just reserved. No one wants to be doing Usually I'm in the front row. I don't know.
Squishy here on this little tiny little.
You're good. I just drank all my water.
Well, if you need to step off and yeah, that's right. My phone just fell asleep.
Those are big sandwiches.
Yeah, they're delicious though. Sorry, I just forgot to turn the mic on. Okay. Hello, everyone. So this is for the Future of Fundraising meeting. So if you're here for something else, well, you've got a bit of a treat. Because we're talking about money. And I think if anything's come up so far this morning is that money is also quite important. So I will introduce myself in just a few moments, but I want to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about in this presentation, so you have a pretty good understanding of kind of how the conversation is going to unfold. So if you want to... You could press the side button. There we go, cool. Excellent. So we'll be talking about, I'll be talking a little bit about what's the current state of fundraising, but also sources of revenue within our sector. And then what options are there out there that we at the NCRA have seen happening at stations around the country. So we've been able to pull some different ideas from different stations we've talked to. So some of those will be presented. And we also have some other fantastic panelists, and we'll introduce those in just a second. And then there's most of the time for today's sessions actually be for Q&A, maybe a bit of collective brainstorming. And feel free to engage with the Slido. I can't see what's going on over there, but DJ Barry again. I reckon it's just Barry promoting himself. I think that's he wants some more gigs, and that's what it is. All right. So my name is Luke Smith. I'm the membership coordinator for the NCRA. I am paying attention. I'm not texting. It's really hard to see that from down here. So I have on my phone. And if you want to shuffle through. Yes? Okay. Oh, somebody there is dimming lights.
In the dreaded after lunch spot.
Oh.
Close your eyes. We can't tell.
If you fall asleep, I'm going to poke people. That's what's going to happen. All right. Excellent. So I'm the membership coordinator. I've had a chance to chat with a lot of you. We visited 10 stations recently, so some of you have seen quite a lot of me. And I've spent about a year under one of the Radio Fund of Canada grants really focusing on fundraising within our sector. So this is kind of presenting some of what I've seen after working for a year, looking at what is out there and what's available. And then we're also joined by Glenn. Do you want to say something?
I think I get this.
Oh, you got a little one. Okay.
Sure. So we're just doing introductions?
Yeah, just... Yeah.
Okay. Glenn, I'm a station manager at a small community station in the sense of the community's small, 7,000 people in Smithers, British Columbia. So about a gentle 14-hour drive from here. Is that good?
Yeah. Oh, it is Johnny.
Hey everybody, my name's Johnny. I am the station manager for CFUV in Victoria. So campus station, we've been on air FM since 1984, so been around for quite a long time as well. And I'm currently the president of the board for the NCRA.
Wow, our stations have the same birth year on FM. My name's Mel Zaitzoff. I'm the station manager and executive director for CJSR FM in Edmonton.
Yeah, so it says a little bit on the actual presentation as to what each of them will be speaking to. So we have that to look forward to as well. So, yeah. All right. So what does current funding look like across the sector? Now, the presentation this morning, I think, did a pretty good job of highlighting the most prominent sources, but we have a bit more of a nuanced understanding because we've got to talk to you all more one-on-one. So student levies are by far the biggest funding source. For our members, it's about double what we see in funding drives, is what comes from student levies. And then it's followed by funding drives, or radiothons, or fund drives, or whatever you folks have decided to call it today. And then we have the Radio Fund of Canada has given substantial sums in support of projects across the sector. And then we don't see as many, but there's some municipal grants out there, some federal and provincial funding outside of the Radio Fund, and then foundations and member fees and donor programs are not as common. So, as I mentioned, we did a study of the student levies based on what you folks have told us. So the annual returns that you give us, and when you hand us that information, we're able to find out things like, 3.1 million was raised in 2016 through student levies. I mean, of the people who told us about it. We expect it's much more than that, but it gives you a really good idea of the scope of that as a source of funding. We're not going to be talking about student levies here. And we also, there's about 1.26 we were told was raised in funding drives. So this is a bit of a snapshot of our infogram on funding drives. Let me get there. There we go. So CGSW traditionally raises a heck of a lot. So congrats CGSW on your great success there. And then there's some of the top 5, and then we have a bit more. So we also measure success in lots of different ways. So QCCR gets the most dollars per person. So I think that's a pretty neat way of approaching it as well. So you should talk to the folks out in Liverpool. They're not here today, but they have some unique ideas on how to do funding drives. And Halliburton, so Canoe FM, which is I don't know, it's forever be shamed, I can't remember the call letters. But Canoe FM and Halliburton, they do their funding drives on Mother's Day. So people can call in and do a shout out to their mothers and donate for like $5 to kind of get to go, thanks mom, on the radio. And it's a pretty neat idea of like tying it to a day. And a lot of people have things out on the front lawn to kind of generate traffic. So we see a lot of these brilliant ideas out there, and we're trying to kind of share them as much as we can. There is a presentation about funding drives, and there's a wiki on it that we try and keep updated as well. So if you want to know about funding drives, this is where that conversation ends, and we recommend you just look at our website for more of that information. So the Community Radio Fund of Canada has given a very substantial sum. This is from their report. I just got distracted there for a second. Thanks, Brian. So their report actually has a lot of information. I'm not going to talk too much about it because they're actually going to be talking about how they are constrained in what they have to fund in the presentation that follows this. So if you have any questions around why they choose which projects they do, and also around what kind of strings are being pulled on their purse and what guides their decisions, they'll be going over all of that in the next session. So what I found doing the research over the past year or so is that there are substantial challenges. And one of the biggest areas that we identified is there are very few grants that you're even eligible for. So for example, Heritage Canada is one of the largest granting bodies out there. There's a lot of money in Heritage Canada. It's essentially where they direct a lot of the cultural funding. But according to Heritage Canada, radio is neither heritage nor arts. We're a cultural institution, and we're very much treated like commercial stations when it comes to accessing grants through Heritage Canada. Now, I think we mentioned later in the presentation that we're looking to address that moving forward through some kind of proactive lobbying. But it does mean that there's a lot of doors closed to this sector, which is a bit of an issue. We also found that economic development funding there are some areas where you can access economic development funding. So Canoe FM in Halliburton, for example, got a couple of thousand to hire somebody through this kind of job creation program outside of Canada Summer Jobs. But it's really difficult because economic development funding from the federal government gets sent to your and often your provincial governments have those corporations only kind of restrictions placed on them at that point. I think as far as I'm aware, it's only the East Coast and Ontario that has non-profit elements of it from that money that's direct from the federal government. So we're going to be also looking into how do we get the economic development funding from the government at the federal level to also keep those doors open as it goes down the chain, so that you can have access to hiring people not related to a Radio Fund grant, but rather related to creating jobs within your stations. So that's something that has come up, and I just need to recheck where I am. Yes. So the other thing is there's a lack of evidence. So I got a phone call from CCAW, so CKAW, in Aurora, and in Ontario, and they were writing an Ontario Trillium grant. And they're like, okay, do you have any statistics, any research that we can put in to prove to the Ontario granting body that radio is an effective tool? So some kind of quantitative evidence that goes, and look, this is how amazing it is. And as the NCRA, we didn't have that. We don't have something that we can point to. So as Barry was saying at the start of the session this morning, it's extremely important to us to help foster this research so that when you're applying in grants, you can point to that evidence. But at the moment, it's not there. So these things all kind of are massive barriers to funding for you folks outside of the Community Radio Fund. There's little statistical evidence or research out there to support it that we found. There's a massive gap in terms of heritage or arts funding which is available. And there's a couple of other considerations as well, which I think we've detailed there. Oh my gosh, Brian corrected me, CKHA. Thank you very much for Canoe FM. Good call. It would have bugged me all day if I forgot who that was. All right. So the municipal grants are not very common, but a couple of people kind of brought it to attention that some stations do have them. I don't know enough about those to really be able to offer much support. And in terms of foundations, in Canada, foundations are kind of restricted in that charities generally have to give money to other charities. That's the caveat. So foundations, 9.5 times out of 10 won't give money to nonprofits. So we also face that massive barrier as well. So when you're looking for where do we get money, a lot of doors to the government are closed, a lot of doors to arts funding is closed, a lot of doors to foundations are closed. So we need to really kind of focus our attention as the NCRA on how do we open up those doors and kind of access that funding. There is some caveats. If you partner with a charity organization, which I think Glenn may speak to later, you can access different pools of funding in collaboration. And I think you've done that as well. It's a collaborative approach.
Yeah, we try and be really creative. I wanted to add a point about heritage.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I had a chance to sit down with a couple of the staff as part of the consultation they did rolling across the country. And they basically wanted to know what we got from our campus, our city, and provincially. They flat out said, we don't jump on the train unless we know you're getting support there. So what I might encourage you to do is something really non-traditional. And we didn't do this in an organized way through the station, but we currently have Chris, who's our news coordinator. He's also the City of Edmonton's Historian Laureate, which he applied for independently and is podcasting a series called Let's Find Out for them. That is in fact funded by the Edmonton Historical Board and the Edmonton Heritage Council, who is a funder and who has shown some interesting interest in us at this point because they're wanting to access people that way. So you might find there's a gap between maybe what's federally available and you may be able to access something a little closer to home in possibly a non-traditional way. We don't employ Chris full-time. He works 30 hours a week, which gives him the opportunity to do those kinds of freelance projects and supplement his income.
I'm gonna have to figure out what I it's all good.
My bad.
All right. Some folks here maybe signed up to our fundraising email list. If you're not, jump on board. And sometimes we do the Fundraising Friday questions, where I think monthly donors was a question that we kind of put out recently. And what we're doing now is we're capturing those conversations, and then we're putting them onto a wiki. So if you weren't there for that email exchange, or you just got 50 emails that day, probably from us, then it's a good way of just checking the Wikipedia entries afterwards and seeing what other stations are doing, because the idea of monthly donation is great, but how does that work in the context of campus and community stations? And that's exactly what we're hoping to provide through our mailing lists and our Wikipedia, is kind of this sector's perspective on funding and fundraising. So this is just a little shout out to our mailing list to get folks on board there. So I think you're a wee bit behind. There we go. Any questions so far? It is fundraising-list, I think. List, L-I-S-T, at ncra.ca, or you could email me at luke@ncra.ca, and I'll get you signed up to the list as well. All right. So, like I mentioned earlier, we are hoping to work in conjunction with Arctic Canada, Arctic Quebec, and most likely the Radio Fund of Canada to address these federal level barriers to funding. So in terms of big picture, we are looking to do our best in terms of opening more of those doors for you folks as well. But at the moment, it's kind of early in the process, so we're not able to kind of provide that. And we're also teaming up with researchers, and if you're aware of any, send them our way, so that we can create a database of journals and printed materials that you can then cite in your grant applications as well, to kind of make those more competitive in the nonprofit kind of area. Now, we do have an element on arts-based funding, but I'm not going to really talk too much about that. I know a lot of you haven't had much success, or may not even have thought about accessing arts-based funding, but I know Johnny's going to speak to that once I've wrapped up. And I've personally been doing my best to encourage everyone under their sun to switch to monthly donors. So contact your one-off donor base and see if they're willing to give slightly less but on a monthly basis. In terms of financial security, you know exactly what you're getting every month, and it helps to stabilize organizations. And if you can convert even just a percentage of your Radiothon funders into monthly funders, as a station, you'll have a much better idea of what's coming in going through the year, as opposed to just one-off. I know stations who have aimed for 20, 30,000 and brought in 15, and then you have to deal with that difference in planning. And we've also had stations who have gone the other way, where they've expected 30, and I think Johnny, you went way over your expectation recently, so that was a good news story. But we encourage a bit of caution and really getting people to do monthly donors. And there's a bit more about that on our website, and if there's any questions, I can field that a little later on as well. So that's kind of what people are doing. We have seen some radio stations do summer camps, which I'm a great fan of. I think the idea of getting youth doing like the March break and the summer break in the studio, so we're talking kind of high school age or younger, doing programming, it kind of gets them engaged. They're in early stage. It kind of creates that loyalty. We've seen with stations that do summer camps that those youth, a percentage of them nearly always then come when they're older. They go there at university, or they take it as their choice of career. But that's certainly an approach. We're looking into whether or not we should develop a template for a summer camp, if that's something that folks would find useful. So kind of a ready to roll out model for the summer camps. So that's one thing that we've seen. Aaron Levy, I don't know if he's still here, but CIVL did a small festival, which was very successful. Yet again, it's about kind of cementing a relationship in the community and opening different revenue streams, different opportunities. So you folks really are the experts on your local music scene. and really capitalizing on that, I think is, it's turned out to be worth the risk with some of these stations that we've spoken to. So that's certainly another idea, which is a little untraditional. And then we know CKOA, is that the one? They have a big focus on, they have a fantastic endowment funding program. So when folks pass, then their estate is able to donate to the station. It's worth considering because for the large campus stations that were founded in like 75, 76, in the 80s, those folks who were key founding volunteers, they're now edging, you know, near the bucket. So it's, or death, to put it a bit more grimly. So it's worth thinking now about how do I capture the legacy of their volunteering and the legacy of their donations through their estate. And it's, you need to think carefully because I think a lot of estates, they look for charitable receipts for the estates. So if you, as a non-profit, want to access that funding, you kind of want to get the ball rolling before they pass, politely and carefully, of course. So you don't want to encourage people to think that you're digging their grave, as it were. But we've seen a great success in CKOA, just in Alberta, with that. There's been conversation on the email list about GoFundMe or Patreon accounts. I set one up, but I haven't told anybody about it, so it's not very successful so far. Although you can donate if you're so pleased, but I'll link you guys later instead of shamelessly plugging during the middle of the presentation. And Cortez Radio, and it made it in here, they sell lamps, which I think is fantastic, and I'm hoping that you'll speak to it a little later. But they sell, I think you told me you've sold 1,600 of these lamps in your community of about 1,000 people. And it's fantastic because it's identifying a product that the community needs and values and kind of cornering the market. People like to buy local. They like to buy things that they know is supporting a cause. So maybe rolling out a sort of, maybe not merchandise, but products that are of use to your community might be a great new way of opening a different line of revenue as well. And it's worked fantastically for Cortez, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about that later. Success with advertising. Prince Edward County brings in about 300,000-400,000 in advertising, but they're also the only game in town. And they've done that by really cementing their image as the voice of the county. It's county radio. They are who you go to be access that audience. So I think maybe it's some lessons in branding there is ideal. And I'm sure if you have a conversation with my colleague Juanita, she can help you out one-on-one as stations in approaching that as an option. And contact CJPE as well directly, and kind of learning what best practices they have. So I do have the next slide as question time. So if there's anything that's jumped out that you specifically want me to answer right now, we'll take those. If not, we'll pass it over to the presenters and pick it. Oh yes, go ahead.
I'm wondering what CFUV for
So we have monthly donors at CFUV, and we use PayPal. But we also have done it through the University of Victoria, so we have, but that wouldn't be something that we could pass along. That's UVic's development department and their tools they use, but right now we're also using PayPal for it.
Awesome.
How would you go about starting a conversation about people donating their estate?
It's very difficult, but it actually is easiest when the people who are doing that or interested talk to each other about it. So that's how it's been starting to happen for CFUV. One of our longtime community member donors told us that they were going to include us in their will, and then I asked them if they could talk about that with other people, and then it's less staff going and speaking to them. But I would point everyone with that question to look outside of community radio for resources. This is a very standard fundraising practice, and you could look into something called the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Charity Village. They all have free workshops and tutorials about this kind of fundraising. Mel and I were just literally talking about this before we started, and just saying that for a long time, community radio only looked at one kind of fundraising, which was a funding drive. But it's in the grand scheme of fundraising that nonprofits do, that's a very small kind of fundraising. So exploring those tools, Charity Village, Association of Fundraising Professionals.
You may also just get in the mail, like I did, a really nice, polite letter from a different association entirely that's in our community that was having their own awareness sort of campaign on that kind of giving. It was a great letter. I stuck it in my drawer, and I plan on sending one around at some point. If you have a volunteer, I know I recently had someone that's involved in our community who was planning just for their estate, and they approached independently. I'd kind of rather plant the seed out there so you sort of know what might be coming at some point, or if there's something out there. Otherwise, you'll get a call from an estate house just asking for, in my case, it was for charitable information, so they will get a tax receipt. But lots of organizations send those, and you could probably find a ton of sample letters that are very well written already.
So we're actually going to, is it worth jumping to your presentation, passing all the questions to the end? If you are worried about forgetting it, just put it up on Slido, of them on the Slido. I'm just aware that you've unique perspectives to bring, and I want to make sure that those are all brought there as well. But drop it onto Slido, because then we can also make sure it's captured in the recording, and folks on the live stream can hear all the questions as well. So did you want to kick it off talking about?
Sure.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So I'm the only representation or point of view coming from community radio here in the panel, which I think is a valuable point, because I think it's quite different. We have different challenges, and the challenges differ based on which community you serve, because our community is 7,000 people, and it's a very remote community up in northern British Columbia, where our next closest neighbor of consideration is Terrace, is 2 hours away, and that's 20,000 people, and our broadcasting doesn't go that far, so we don't really, ask them for any money. So where we have very specific challenges in that our pool that we can ask for money from our memberships or our sponsorships, which is one of our places where we do get money from, is relatively small. We don't have student levies. We don't do advertising, because there's already a couple stations in town that are commercial who do advertising, and they've shaken those trees to the point there's nothing left in them. So what's the point there? So our funding focuses are generally slightly different in that we are looking for partnerships. So I'm just going to quickly give you some numbers. So CICK been broadcasting for 8 years, and we broadcast out of a 100-year-old train car, and so we got that as a really cool tool, because it's very unique. It's a lounge car. It was refurbished in the 50s. It's like unbelievably beautiful, and we built a stage on the outside. We've got a stage on the inside, and that's our tool into our partnerships. And so what we do there. I'll quickly tell you the numbers. Okay, $80,000 approximately, programming, operations, everything. So small. 3 part-time positions, and so primarily, a lot of the money goes towards those positions. If we don't raise the money, those positions start getting. You could start seeing problems where some of the momentum that we create and some of the partnerships that we create that we have to maintain start becoming at risk. So we need to spread out our funding options. So donations, we do get a little bit sometimes in donations. We actually received a significant donation recently of 12 grand, which is crazy. But we're not going to expect that on a regular basis. We do fundraising, and basically we just get people really drunk, and then they give us money. And then our sponsorships, we raise maybe We had about $4,000, $5,000 in sponsorships, and then our members bring in about $1,500 to $2,000 there. Then we got a little bit of we stood dabbling with the NCRA national advertising stuff. We made a total of about $120 there, and then community. Then we got some of the local funding, so municipal stuff. So we have a community forest, and a lot of these communities in northern British community forest, which is they get a lot of piece of land, and they can maintain the forests and take it, turn it into timber, and that profit goes back into the community. We've hit that up on a regular basis to a tune of somewhere around $10,000 a year sometimes. We do try to give them a break every once in a while, so they kind of forget that we need them on a regular basis. But we do go there pretty often. And then we got, we've been doing BC Gaming. So over the last 3 years, we got 2 BC Gaming grants. And I'll get into more about that in a second. CFRC has been a major funder for us. We got something, and then now, okay, this is where we're gonna get into the stuff. So BC Gaming, we got into BC Gaming because we use the angle of we're an arts organization. So Johnny's gonna probably talk about that to some extent, because in our community, we can't get by just station. We've got to be more integrated within the community. We got to show them the value of what we're doing. And by doing that, I think our best way of doing that is to show them that we can support artists and we can help broaden what people listen to in the community. We could bring in music that wouldn't normally come into the community. We could do all these things and make life a better place for them in the community as an artist, or as an audience member, or as just a community member who's interested in hearing some different stuff. So part of it has been communicating that to our community, but also part of that has been opening up doors to funding options, and BC Gaming is one of them. So one of the things is like, okay, we're gonna bring in touring artists, we're gonna put them in our lounge car, this beautiful train car, we're gonna do webcasts and streaming, and we're gonna do it live on 93.9 and the whole works, and they like that. And so if I don't see I copied it from Johnny, so it's not like it's a secret. So if anybody else wants to do it, I don't see any danger in doing it. I don't think they're gonna shut the tap off because everybody's doing it. But that's BC. Then partnerships. So being that we are now an arts organization, we can look at other arts organizations that have access to funds that we can't normally access. An example is, so we have a concert association, the Bulkley Valley Concert Association, and they write this grant. I think it's a touring artist grant or something like that, that they get money where they get 50% of the artist fees covered for anybody that they bring in to the community from within the province. So they asked us a few years ago, because they had this artist that was coming through town, and they wasn't originally on the bill, and they said, you guys have 50 volunteers. We have 4 volunteers. We can't present this extra band. Can you throw a couple volunteers our way? And we thought about it, and we were like, well, that makes sense. I mean, we don't see that as a lot of work, because we're often trying to really balance carefully how much work is going to go into that money that's going to come to us. Because sometimes if you take on too much, you end up draining your volunteers, and then you can't create that again. You can't rely on that funding again because your volunteers won't do it again. So it seemed like a good one. It was just a couple people at the door, a couple posters up, and we presented Harpoonist and the Axe Murderer, and it filled the house, and we made $3,000. So we were like, oh, that's sweet. Since then, we now have a relationship with the Concert Association where we do this on an annual basis. Now, we don't, in this particular relationship, we've decided the most important thing isn't necessarily the money, it's about the outreach and about the other part of our mission, which is expanding the genres of music that's coming into our community. So we've decided that if we break even, that's cool. We actually decided even if we lose just a little bit of money, that's still cool. So we shifted to like bringing in really wacky genres of music that the community's never heard before, and being okay with the fact that we have half the house full. But the thing is, with this grant, we don't have as much risk because half their fees are covered by the grant. So we never are going to be at risk for any significant amount of money. So it's still a sweet deal for us. And it's great because now we're creating ourselves, again, as this arts organization that's bringing in this really cool music and creating that audience and following, and also creating our image as this kind of cool organization, which brings in more volunteers and then potentially more memberships and funding and so on. So it's working out really well in that aspect. And the Concert Association just wrote another grant that we would have no access to. Does Canada 150, was that a heritage grant? They wrote a heritage grant, Canada 150, to the tune of $100,000. And we, because of our relationship with them, we're going to get a chunk of it because we have this annual Deck Fest thing on our outside performance stage, and they saw it as a great opportunity, and they also see us as kind of like having a connection to the community as sort of like the edgy new wave kind of stuff, and they were like, well, maybe we can partner with you guys and we'll give you a portion of this money and you guys present and curate this show that's going to happen as part of the Canada 150 celebrations, which is kind of actually the cool aspect of this is that and so that's the other aspect, is that it helps open the door for us to bridge our communities with our Indigenous population. We're curating this primarily all Indigenous youth-focused performance, and we're going to get a chunk of this money. And in addition, we're also on the hook for doing a bunch of workshops with youth and stuff like that. But again, a cool opportunity for outreach, and we're also getting a chunk of money out of this. So that's the thing about like working with community. So like the next thing is like, okay, well, what's the next community organization that we can to talk to that has access to money that we can't get? So those are the questions that we kind of have to keep asking ourselves. So being really aware of your community and where are those pots of money, and sitting down with them and being like, how can we help you in exchange for a little percentage of what you guys are bringing in? So that's really going to be an important part of how we're going to be sustainable, by spreading ourselves out like that. The other couple of places that we're going to be looking at in the future is continuing to tap the arts funding. So BC Arts Council is a place that we're going to be hitting up pretty soon, because we had a conversation with somebody from the BC Arts Council, and I think we've convinced them that some community stations and some campus stations are arts organizations, are integral parts of the community in that aspect. And so I think we haven't yet written a grant that, and we haven't seen any money from yet, but we're going to be doing that soon. The next one, actually one that we're going to do really soon, I see Brenda over there, I'm going to come to you really soon. Name it, who do you represent again? BC Music Fund, thank you. So BC Music Fund is a pool of money right now that's out there. If you don't get, you probably have been getting, I'm hoping you guys have been getting emails probably like every 3 days that keep saying, we got a new pool of money, or we have this existing pool of money, send your applications our way. And so, but it is about supporting artists. And if you can find a way to get your community and campus station to a place where you can support local community your local artists, I think you can actually defend an argument that you deserve a piece of that pie, because we have this big tool, and this tool can be used in all sorts of ways, but I see the tool being used to support artists, and that's what makes us arts organizations, and that's what opens the door to these different funding opportunities.
Either way.
I think questions come later, right?
Hey everybody, Johnny again still. Yeah, I want to go next because I think what I have to talk about echoes well with what Glenn was speaking about. So there's all sorts of different kinds of fundraising. I could rant about this all night. If anyone wants to talk about making money for radio stations, it's one of my favorite things to do, so I'll see you at the spots with beer. But I want to talk right now about getting money for making radio. And I think that I'm a huge hypocrite because we totally do things that aren't radio to do fundraising, but at the same time, I am kind of encouraging people to try using the thing you know, radio for your community, as a gateway for you to access other kinds of funding, specifically grants. So as Glenn mentioned, I'll just quick rundown, CFUV, over 30 years old. Our revenue is $350,000. About $100,000 of that is grants. And then 175 is student fees. So grant writing and grant funds are a huge part of the revenue for our station. We get funding from the radio fund, we get funding from BC Gaming. We also now get funding from the BC Arts Council. We've had 2 years of successful funding from BC Arts Council. And anytime I talk about this to people, they're always blown away by what we're funded for. We make a radio show. That is quite literally all we do for them. We don't do any events out in the community. It is a program. When we applied, we called it a podcast, but I think everyone in this room knows the interchangeability of those terms, but that's part of trying to understanding what is attractive to funders at the time. So if you get a chance, they're not in the room right now, our program director, Katie Sage, is the person who initiated this program. It's called Artscape. This was originally funded by the on-air program from the Radio Fund. It was a huge success for us. We then continue to pursue funding opportunities for this program. So, and when we were talking earlier about grants building up your opportunity, we couldn't apply for that same thing to the Radio Fund, but we knew it was valuable. We'd had the successful model, and somebody had already funded us to do it, which made it a lot easier to get funding later. We are receiving just shy of $10,000 this year for this program. We're producing only 10 episodes of the program, so the province is giving us money, and we are paying artists to come and produce 1 hour of radio about arts. So it's just artists and artists talking to artists on CFUV, and so now that we've been funded twice for this, we're now eligible for the BC Arts Council operational funding, which is a very exciting thing that we're going to be looking at within the next year here. Coming up in October, we can apply for that. So I think that, I don't want to take up a ton of time, but I would just encourage people that, I know everybody has different capacities for their station, but we are all nonprofits and we are all making radio. I heard Luke say that those doors are closed to some of those funding opportunities. Luke and I have had this conversation before. I disagree that they're closed. I think none of us are going and even trying to open the door because we have our capacity issues, but we also have this perception, I think, in our sector that we always need to come up with this brand new, amazing idea every time we want money from people, but we are really only experts in making radio for our community. And what I would encourage people to do is figure out how to sell that to the granting agencies. It's about figuring out what goals the granting agencies have, and then you show them how you can do it. I had a meeting with somebody in Victoria, the executive director of an organization called Volunteer Victoria, and they work with a lot of nonprofits in the city. And they said to me that they wished they had the flexibility that radio stations have for grant writing. And what they meant by that was, we could apply for any kind of grant. I could go and apply for environmental funding grants if I'm going to do an environmental radio program. And you also have the value that your radio shows are in turn promoting the grant agency's work, which a lot of applicants actually don't. They just have their internal impact. But we are, you know, we're pumping the radio fund every time we put on their programs, and that's something that you should be selling to them when you're putting your applications in. So yeah, if anybody is curious, it's Artscape on CFUV. You can listen to the show. It's a good show, but honestly, it's not any better than anything you were all making. It's just that we were relentless about asking for money for it over and over and over again. And they said, no, blah, 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 this. And then you change your application and you try again and again. And then you get into positions like CICK, and we are in with BC Gaming funds. That money is just coming now. We don't have to do anything anymore. It's $25,000 for us this year. We just applied for $50,000. So keep pushing on those. And the reason I'm passionate about this is that if all of you were applying to these funds as well, we wouldn't have to keep re-explaining what the work we are doing is. It would stop being a question of what community radio is and go just to a conversation about the projects that we're doing.
We really need to talk more. So what Johnny's saying really resonates with me. We also have gaming funding in Alberta, and if anyone, can you just show me by your hands, is everyone incorporated provincially? Like, pretty much, yeah. Okay, so we also have gaming money. To us, it means 2-day casino, basically every year. We do reporting every year for that. We apply for our casino license. It's not particularly arduous. In our province, gaming has to be done by volunteer and charity organizations. It means to us somewhere between $35,000 and upwards of $40,000 a year. My last check from gaming was $81,000 and some dollars. So it's a ton of money for 2 days of volunteer work, and we let anyone opt out of it. For anyone that's opposed to gambling or maybe has a problem, we don't require people to disclose or anything. They just don't have to do it if they don't want to. We no longer do bingos and haven't for a long time. I would strongly encourage you to apply. We access that funding actually as an education-based organization, totally different. And basically what we highlighted was that we will train anyone that comes to the station as a public facility. So you don't have to be a student. You can also, we're a campus-based community organization is how we refer to ourselves. So you can come in and access as much training as you want to for free, basically, at the station. And we've been getting that money regularly, really easily for a long time now. I try and look outside of traditional streams as well, and that's really a huge focus for me right now. So the CRA has a list, if you haven't seen it, they have links by province of organizations that support provincially and municipally, depending, and gaming associations by province. So you can check to see how it's run in your province if you don't already access that. We started, and I know other stations in Alberta have been doing this, we've been really focusing hard on increasing capacity. And so for us, that means people. And I didn't want to turn around and use student money to fund student bursaries, and yet I want students to get bursaries. So we accessed a program called the SKIP program. It's Serving Communities Internship Program. We can have up to $20,000 bursaries for post-secondary students under that program. It's very easy for students to access and apply for those positions. We can favor our own volunteers if we want to through that process. We applied for 4, got all 4, and we'll be upping it to 8 next year and upwards from there. It was really easy. We structured projects that needed being done, maybe a little bit more reliably than strictly a volunteer project, which might fall off a bit. And we could highlight some leaders in our organization in the volunteer pool with those bursaries. I would encourage you strongly to tap on people that are already doing it, like we did with Magnus when we put forward our Canada Summer Job applications, which we hadn't really done before, targeted as well. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have had those in without his support, and I'm sure anyone would share that. We also are looking to access a community foundation, Edmonton Community Foundation grants this year, as well as Alberta Culture and Tourism has grants for not-for-profit organizations. So both of those programs will offer project-based funding, capital projects, infrastructure projects, and operating. For us, the key is trying to find something that isn't tied specifically to a project. So right now our focus is capital, so we'll be applying under some of those. But what I'm always looking for is core funding, because we have a hard time just getting the everyday stuff done, and sometimes adding a project is really difficult when you're still tasked with your regular job. So we try and find ways to write those grants so that they underwrite some of those initiatives that still need to happen, and flexibly try and do that. But I would encourage anyone that doesn't have gaming money to go out there and get it. It's not really hard to get. It's pretty easy to report on. Anyone can do it, even someone without a financial background.
It's different based
Yep.
on province.
It is different by province, for sure. For sure. But you can find that information on the Canada Revenue site if you're wondering.
I just wanted to jump on a couple of things. Johnny mentioned leveraging the fact that you're a radio station. We do that at the national level. So when we applied for the large grant that funded the Rendezvous de la Francophonie program, at the value of $15 per PSA, per station, per show, per week. I mean, I remember writing a grant where we valued the exposure at over $1 million, and that's what we bring to the table before we even ask for money. So absolutely, if we're grant writing, leverage the fact that you can broadcast PSAs and that kind of thing. And also, a lot of grants that we've seen come through don't cover any kind of administration, oversight and management costs that you will face, and you want to capture that in your applications to support your core funding and support your other salaried positions who would have to be looking after those positions anyway. So there's a couple of key things from the granting element that I've seen here, and that's leverage the fact that you're a radio station, and also capture some of your management costs as well if possible. So I think, how are we on time, Barry? 8 minutes. So it's going to be a bit of a lightning round. I have a couple of questions here on the Slido. So summer camps, any concerns with liability or insurance? We have a great folks over at Spark Insurance. If I was you, just send them an email and find out. I can't see that being too much of an issue. For campuses, that's where I've seen these summer camps taking place. And they generally are tied to the insurance of the schools, and the universities generally also run their own summer camps. So you may be able to get into bed with them on that. And any legal implications in being an organization that is not a registered charity, soliciting for donations via planned giving. I think you have to call a spade a spade. That's the biggest part. You can't go in and make it sound like you are a charity. We have 6 radio stations which are charities. I forget, are you one of them? Yep, you're one of the 6. But it's extremely rare for radio stations to be charities. But if you're not, I mean, these are folks who usually are long-time volunteers. They want to give. And maybe for those folks, don't overestimate the value of the tax receipt. They may want to have a legacy even without the tax receipt. So make sure that if you are a non-profit, that you're telling them up front and having that frank conversation about what you can do for the estate and what just isn't possible. And I believe a lot of folks would still stick with you. So, yep.
Just on that point, it's probably not a bad idea. You could have an accountant ask your accountant to get a proper understanding of what the implications for a potential donor are. So
Yeah.
inform yourself ahead of time.
Yep. For this stream, it was just referenced talking to your accountant as well can be an extremely helpful element. So, any questions for our panelists? Yep.
We're an isolated rural community of 1,000 people, and one of the directions we've gone into is emergency preparedness, and I haven't heard that said. We've been semi-successful with gaming grants for this, getting up systems, power systems, so that when we have power failures, the radio station is still on the air. But where it's really starting to show is private donations and within the community donations. People are reacting to that we're stepping out with that. So it's just something I wanted to throw out.
We actually started thinking about that. We are going to probably use that emergency preparedness angle to work with our search and rescue. They get really well funded, and they don't even know that we're probably the only station in town that has a battery system so that we can stay on the air over a period of time. As a matter of fact, our transmitter's on the top of the hospital, which has got a generator. It's the only building in town that's got an unlimited amount of energy for any length of time. And so we're going to use that angle, and then we're going to try to approach our town. They're really difficult to get money out of them, but just for the same reason, tell them that we're the only place in town where you can get a message across when the power goes out.
It's just to jump on that. You all had to put emergency broadcasting systems in, and some of the smaller communities got that expense covered by the municipalities.
Nope.
Well, maybe not in your case, but some of them did, yeah. Right, we have any other questions? At the back, and I'll work my way around.
You had mentioned that you sort of like custom tailor some of your grant applications for your producers who are going to be making programs. So say an artist who's doing a program about arts, and you go to an arts council and say, hey, you want to fund this for us? Do you ever do just like sort of calls for proposals and make like granting sources available to the public so they can be like, hey, we want to do this really cool radio show for you. We're going to make this grant proposal for you, and then you sort of like submit it on their behalf? Or how would you do that?
Is that for me?
I think
That's me.
I'm sorry.
Nope. We tailor, much like Johnny does, we tailor our applications based on what the strategic objectives are of whatever program we're applying for. We do not give up radio time for dollars, actually. My news coordinator would string me up for that. We don't do that at all. But we definitely, so I'm not typically going, I think the closest we got to a specific programming grant this last year was related to a program director grant we had through the Radio Fund. And it was specifically to have that position create infrastructure through the other bursary program we applied for, to employ some students basically to create the infrastructure for a show, to train more students, to get them on air with programming that's specifically by students for students, in a way where we could fast track more of them on air.
So you wouldn't, say, for example, have someone who's working with you or volunteering with you who's like super into like fishing, and then go to like any wildlife council and be like, hey, we have a guy who really loves fishing. Can we do like,
Yeah,
I don't know.
It depends. Like we have environmental programming, and they have applied for different kinds of grants before. So through like Alberta Public Interest, for example. But it's consistent with their values. They're not really exchanging something in particular for that. They want to do a permafrost documentary. They'll probably also apply for some kind of environmental funding for that. But if it was, not necessarily. It depends. But Johnny has more.
I would say that I would caution against that approach, and the reason is that you are coming up with a project before you're looking for grants, and you are going to be trying to shoehorn an idea that you've already formed, and that's when you're going to get turned down on grant applications. We've had our most success by finding where the money is and then working backwards and seeing if something we're already doing is in that path. But especially if you're bringing out in external people, then you have two groups that are trying to craft a project. I don't think those are going to be very successful applications. But you can work with other groups, and so we have done similar to what you described. We got funding from the BC Arts Council for a music event that we do, but that was one of the curators that we were working with. They've applied for the funding for just a small element of it because they were more eligible for funds than we were. So you can kind of do that, but yeah, biggest caution I would give is don't come up with your project until you know that you meet the eligibility and you build your project based on what the funders are looking for. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time and you're not going to get the money.
So our perspective on that is we just had a conversation at the board level where we don't have the resources to look for funding for particular programming, and we're a little bit cautious of that because we also don't want funding to sort of direct our programming, so or to control the programming in any particular way. We want to have that freedom. So, but we did come up with, if a DJ wants to find a source of funding for their show, they can go and search for a grant, as long as they bring the proposal to the station so that we are aware of who they're going to seek for funding and that it's not going to have an impact on that kind of control over the programming. We want that freedom want freedom across all our programming. In exchange for, I think we were going to ask for an administration fee if it's over a certain amount. If they bring in over a certain amount, then we're going to ask for an administration fee because they're using our equipment and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's how we look at it that way. The only time we actually spend resources when it's program-related funding is if we see a show that really matches well or partners well with an existing business that we could potentially ask for sponsorship money for. So for example, we had a show that is a show about animals, pets, and specifically where people would leave messages for their pets so that they could play the messages while they're at work for their pet to listen to. And we were like, oh my God, that's perfect for our vet. You know, like our vet's gonna love this. And so we went to them and we were like, hey, we got this amazing show. Do you guys want to sponsor it? And they were like, yeah, totally. That's ridiculous. That's awesome.
So we've just about run out of time, but I'm going to give you the last question. If you can make very quick response, or you'll just approach them directly. Excellent. I want to thank the panelists for coming and sharing some of their pearls of wisdom, and let's give them a round of applause. So next up is the granting bodies. So we'll take a minute to just switch over. 5 minutes, and then we'll kick back up again.